This morning you woke up with a scratchy throat, walked to a cabinet, and swallowed a small pill without thinking twice. Within 20 minutes, the ache started to fade. You didn't wonder how it worked. You didn't have to. But for nearly the entire span of time humans have existed, that cabinet did not exist. There was no pill, no label, no dosage, no guarantee. For roughly 300,000 years, every single person who ever lived faced infection, fever, and broken bone with nothing but plants, instinct, and each other. Infection didn't announce itself back then. It didn't come with a warning label, a fever chart, or a name. It arrived invisible, spread in silence, and made every decision about treatment look like a guess, even when it wasn't. And somehow, enough people survived it. Not always, but often enough that you are here to read this sentence. Bones from that world carry something strange. Skulls with holes deliberately cut into them by hand, showing new bone growth around the edges years later. Teeth still coated in the same chemical compound, now sold at every pharmacy on Earth. Skeletons with injuries so severe the person could not have fed themselves, yet who lived on for years afterward. Something was working. The question is what exactly, and whether the instinct that once guided a person holding nothing but a sharpened stone and a handful of bitter leaves is still sitting somewhere inside you, waiting for a moment when the cabinet is empty. In 2012, archaeologist Karen Hardy and her team at the University of Barcelona examined something almost nobody thinks to study. The hardened plaque still clinging to 50,000-year-old Neanderthal teeth, recovered from El Cedron Cave in northern Spain. Buried inside that plaque were chemical traces of chamomile and yarrow, two intensely bitter plants with almost no calories and no taste appeal. An animal eating purely for survival does not choose bitterness, it avoids it. One of the individuals examined also showed signs of a dental abscess and an intestinal parasite. Hardy's team argued the plants weren't food at all. They were treatment, selected deliberately for their properties by a species most people still picture as capable of nothing more than brute survival. This wasn't a lucky guess made once. The same chemical signature turned up again, across teeth, across individuals, across tens of thousands of years, long before anyone had written a single word down. Long before doctors. Long before written language of any kind. Somebody was already running trials, one bitter mouthful at a time, and passing down whatever worked. Humans didn't stop at plants. They opened skulls. Trepanation is the deliberate removal of a section of living skull bone using nothing but sharpened stone, and it stands as one of the oldest surgical procedures ever documented, found on nearly every inhabited continent, with examples stretching back more than 7,000 years. At first, that sounds closer to a death sentence than a treatment. But bone does not lie. When a skull is cut after death, the edges stay sharp and jagged forever. When someone survives the surgery, new bone grows back around the opening, smooth and rounded, sometimes continuing to heal for years. Bioarchaeologist John Verano at Tulane University has spent decades examining trepanned skulls recovered from Peru and found that survival was not a rare accident. In some regions and time periods, most patients lived long enough for the bone to heal completely, which means the surgery worked often enough that entire cultures kept performing it, generation after generation, without ever seeing a nerve, a blood vessel, or a single germ. No anesthesia, no sterilization, no understanding of what a skull actually did. And still, somebody found a procedure that gave people more time, and other people trusted it enough to lie down and let it happen. Breaks tell their own story. When a bone snaps and is left completely alone, it usually heals crooked, calcified at an odd angle, sometimes shortening the limb for good. Paleopathologists studying ancient skeletons keep finding the opposite. Fractures that healed straight, aligned almost the way a modern cast would leave them. That kind of healing does not happen by accident. It requires someone to pull the limb back into position, immobilize it somehow, and keep it stable for weeks while the person recovering could do almost nothing to help themselves, including hunt, gather, or sometimes even walk. Every straight fracture in the archaeological record is really evidence of two things at once: an injury and a second person who stayed. Here's the part that should feel more unsettling than any of that. Some of it wasn't guesswork at all. Ancient Egyptian physicians packed open wounds with honey, a remedy recorded in the Ebers Papyrus, a medical text written around 1550 BCE, alongside dozens of other honey-based treatments for burns, infections, and skin disease. For most of history, that looked like superstition dressed up in the language of medicine. Then researcher Peter Molin at the University of Waikato in New Zealand ran the actual chemistry. Honey generates hydrogen peroxide as it slowly breaks down. Its sugar content is so concentrated that bacteria physically cannot hold on to enough water to survive inside it. Certain varieties carry an additional compound, methylglyoxal, that kills bacteria on direct contact. The Egyptians never knew a single one of those mechanisms. They didn't need to. Across enough generations and enough wounds, they noticed that the ones packed in honey were less likely to turn. And they kept doing what worked, without ever needing to know why it worked. Wound care went further than honey, and further than most people are comfortable picturing. In multiple cultures, separated by oceans and thousands of years, healers deliberately introduced fly larvae into deep wounds. It sounds like neglect. It was closer to the opposite. The larvae consumed dead tissue and left healthy tissue alone, and some appear to have limited bacterial growth at the same time. Nobody involved understood bacteria. They understood outcomes. Wounds treated that way scarred cleaner and killed less often. And that was reason enough to keep doing it. Generation after generation, long before a microscope existed to explain why. None of this happened in isolation from everything else a sick person needed. Across hunter-gatherer societies studied by medical anthropologists, healing was rarely just a leaf or a poultice handed over in silence. It came bundled with ritual. Chanting, touch, a fire kept burning nearby, someone sitting close enough to keep watch through the night. It's tempting to file that half under superstition and the other half under science, as if only the chemistry counted. But stress itself worsens illness, and calm measurably helps the body recover, something modern medicine has only recently started taking seriously again. The healer who sat beside a feverish patient wasn't only offering comfort. They were quite possibly changing the outcome, without any language for what they were doing or why it worked. That pill you swallowed this morning has a direct ancestor, and it wasn't built in a lab. Willow bark contains a compound called salicin, and the Ebers Papyrus lists it as a remedy for pain and swelling. By around 400 BCE, Hippocrates was recommending willow leaf tea for fever and the pain of childbirth. Inside the human body, salicin converts into salicylic acid, the exact compound that chemists at the Bayer Company isolated and modified in 1897 to create acetyl salicylic acid. You know it as aspirin. The pill in your cabinet is not a replacement for what ancient humans were doing. It is a purified, standardized, patented version of it. The line between a Neanderthal chewing bitter bark tens of thousands of years ago and you swallowing a tablet this morning is not a broken line. It is one continuous thread, stretched impossibly thin but never actually cut. Now the part that has nothing to do with chemistry at all. At a site called La Chapelle-aux-Sens in France, researchers uncovered a Neanderthal skeleton so worn down by arthritis and so missing so many teeth that solid food would have been almost impossible to chew in his final years. Someone would have had to soften his food or mash it or chew it first for years, with no expectation of anything he could physically offer in return. Old in that world meant slow, meant expensive to keep alive, meant unable to contribute. And somebody kept him alive anyway. In Shanidar Cave in what is now northern Iraq, researchers uncovered the skeleton of a Neanderthal man, catalogued as Shanidar I, who lived roughly 45,000 years ago. His right arm had withered away, likely crushed or amputated early in life. One eye socket was shattered. He was partially deaf. His legs carried old, fully healed fractures. A man with those injuries could not hunt, could barely walk without assistance. In almost every popular image of prehistoric life, brutal, competitive, every person fending only for themselves, someone like that should not have survived past the initial injury. He lived for years afterward. Paleoanthropologist Eric Trinkhaus, who has studied the Shanidar remains for decades, points to this as some of the clearest physical evidence that Neanderthals cared for their injured and disabled, not out of obligation, but because something in them refused to let a member of the group simply disappear. We like to imagine medicine as something invented, charted, published, owned by people in white coats standing in front of machines. But long before any of that existed, we were already doing the hardest part. We were choosing, over and over, not to let each other die alone. There was rarely a clean line between the physical treatment and everything around it. A wound got packed with honey, but it also got sat with. A fever got treated with willow bark, but someone stayed close enough to notice if it worsened in the night. The treatment was never only chemical. It was also somebody choosing to stay. Think about the last time you were sick, and someone who loved you sat next to your bed anyway, close enough to catch whatever you had. Nobody taught them to do that. Nobody had to. That instinct is not new. It did not arrive with hospitals or insurance cards or pharmacies. It arrived with the first person who packed a wound with honey because they had noticed it helped. The first person who chewed a bitter root because their body told them to. The first group that carried an injured man for years because leaving him behind was never really an option. You didn't invent the impulse to treat sickness with care. You inherited it from further back than writing, further back than agriculture, further back than almost anything you'd call civilization. None of it required a lab, a license, or single peer-reviewed paper. It required paying attention, noticing what helped, staying even when staying carried a real cost. That is the part that never actually needed inventing, and it is the part your cabinet full of pills has never replaced. This morning you swallowed a pill and felt better within 20 minutes, and never once had to wonder if it would work. Somewhere underneath that certainty is 45,000 years of people who had no such guarantee and tried anyway.